We're all born with about 200 very important microbes, and they're starting to go endangered. Now, we're lucky to get a handful. We're missing a lot of them, and I think as soon as the public starts to learn about how important these are, there's going to be a massive race to try to save them. The ways that we were working with the microbiome for the last few decades, they're not effective anymore. The probiotics that we get from foods, they're certainly good, but they don't replace the birth microbes, nor do the dirt and soil microbes. There's not technically a way to get them back once they're lost. And that is what I've spent most of the year working on, how we can stabilize these, how we can get these replanted and back to people. Not telling anyone here to change their diet, but the diet for the birth microbes is very different than what I'm seeing around. It is more similar to what I see in a lot of the tribal regions and kind of across the globe. Glyconutrients are pretty amazing, and there's something that you can incorporate into your diet or you can buy as a supplement. There's 8 different medical ones, and it's possible that we'll find more. Think of them like sugars that heal. These are sugars that are not sweet. They regulate the immune system, block certain infections, pathogens, not opportunistic, from the body. And the more and more we learn about them, the more important they are.
Mary, in our world, when it comes to the microbiome, the gold standard when assessing it is diversity. You're a huge fan of the microbiome. You work with a lot of people. How much weight do you give that metric?
What really matters when we look at the microbiome is not diversity, but what we have in there. You're going to have very different microbes based on what you've eaten throughout your life and what you're eating now. So different medical diets can shift your microbiome, traditional diets do. We're all born with about 200 very important microbes, and they're starting to go endangered. And we can go into that if you like. It's a big topic and one that I'm pretty passionate about. But the assumption that we need a diverse microbiome was based off of human sewer human sewer systems throughout America, looking at healthier cities versus less healthy cities, and then making assumptions because there were too many trillions of factors. However, when you go to the tribal regions that I do, or when you study someone that's in really quite perfect health, they necessarily don't have diverse microbiome. They may have a very simple microbiome. So it really depends on what is in there as to whether the diversity is needed or not.
Okay, so what is it you look to then when you're assessing somebody to see where they're at on the spectrum with their microbiome?
So I look for a few things. One, I look at their birth microbes, because our birth microbes, and to define that for anyone who's not familiar, those are the microbes that you're meant to be born with through the vaginal canal and then fed through nursing. So they're the ones that we're meant to be bestowed upon with. They're very protective for us, and they ward off infections. They make most of our feel-good chemicals. They regulate our weight. They do most of what we don't think about. So they're just kind of important. And so I look at the levels of birth microbes and see if they still have them. If they do, then we'll feed them to raise their populations. Each one needs a different kind of food. And if they don't, if they were naturally born, I'll try to coax them out of what I like to call hibernation. So if someone is born vaginally, they can go and hibernate. Some of them we can plant. So if someone was a C-section or they don't have them or they lost them, some we can plant, others we can't. So I look at the birth microbes. Then I look at the next most important to me is kind of a new class, or at least it should be, in my mind, considered a new class, and that is these pseudopathogens. These are technically overgrowths, technically opportunistic, but you can't starve them out on diets like GAPS and carnivore and the methods that we've used for the last several decades. These will eat your own mucosal layer, which, if you don't feed them, which those diets don't. And so you can actually get worse on those or get more sensitive to food. So I like to look for those because they can make someone's life very difficult when trying to self-heal.
And when it comes to an assessment to begin, is there a certain company or test you like to do to see where we're at?
Yeah, I really love the GI map, and I get no plug from them. I wish I did, but but I'll tell you why I like them. Now, it's just looking at the colon, right? So you have to take that into perspective because the microbiome is over the whole body. But what it looks at very well is the mucosal layer. And for any of you who have seen The Never-Ending Story, I'm dating myself, but it was a favorite movie when I was a kid.
Me too.
Yeah, you too. You know, the nothing that comes in.
It's been a long time, but I did love it.
Okay. Well, there's this nothing that's taking over the world and making this, fantasy world disappear, and the princess is trying to save it, right, through this book. Well, I am seeing something similar to the nothing come into the human microbiome, especially over this last year. In fact, since we last spoke, and it's this incredible mucosal collapse that I've never seen before. And very few of the microbiome tests that people run look at the mucosa. So I like the GI map because I can see if mucosal collapse is going on and if it's in stage 1 or 5 and how to coax it out of that. So that's perhaps my favorite, followed second by another company called Microgen DX, which again, I get no benefit from, folks, but you can test your microbiome of your eye if you have eye issues, your nail, that pesky fungus. You can actually figure out what is causing it. There's 57,000 different microbes they test for all these different areas, your mouth, if you have bad breath, or if you have a wound that won't heal, vaginal canal. So you can just test lots of areas and see exactly what's wrong and work on that.
Let's come back to the birth microbes. How many people you work with still have those intact?
There are about 200 that so far we've seen across the globe, whether someone is born in the Arctic or the Amazon, born naturally to a mother who has never had antibiotics and who has eaten a traditional diet. So now we're in a state of second second generation C-sections, and I was first generation antibiotic. I don't know too many people who were born from a mother who hadn't had antibiotics. So now we're lucky to get a handful, honestly. We're missing a lot of them. And I think as soon as the public starts to learn about how important these are, there's going to be a big, uh, a massive race to try to save them and bring them back in.
You touched on this early on. It sounds like there's a difference there between getting them at birth through the vaginal canal versus trying to get them back later. So let's talk about somebody who was born C-section or had antibiotics. They're no longer in a position where they have everything. What's the best they can do with repopulation?
Personally, I would get a test on. I would do a GI map to see if you have any of those mucus eaters first, because the ways that we were working with the microbiome for the last few decades really aren't efficient. They're not effective anymore. The probiotics that we get from foods, they're certainly good and they have their value, but they don't replace the birth microbes, nor do the dirt and soil microbes. So there's not technically a way to get them back once they're lost. And that is what I've spent most of the year working on, is how we can stabilize these, how we can get these replanted and back to people.
Okay, so we're in a transition process right now. You're working on it. What's the best we can do in the meantime?
It's a really good question. I would feed the birth microbes. So I'd learn what the foods are. These are little things, and I will be coming out with this kind of content. So I'm trying to educate as much as possible while I'm working on the discovery. So things like arabinogalactans or inulin or chitosan, which is from ground up from shells. There's HMO, which there's colostrum. There's a lot of different ones. And a tiny sprinkle is enough to do daily to start to feed. So if they are in hiding, if you do have them, that helps you keep those populations. That's important. Another important thing is really keeping your mucosa alive. The mucosa layer one, you need to not have those pseudopathogens, so check for that. And if so, address those. But it needs a lot of things like zinc and a lot of minerals. So you can work with that as well, I would say. And then if you're naturally born, but you've had a lot of antibiotics, there are certain soil microbes that can rebirth those. Some of the best studies we've seen from that, it's almost like magic, are out of Mexico. So there's a potentiality that some soil microbes can bring your birth microbes back. Those are the things I would be doing mostly. And then, of course, maintaining what you have. So not using harsh soaps, not using antibiotics unless you're dying. I mean, do whatever you want. That's not medical advice from me, folks. But but in general, doing the best you can without, supporting your immune system, eating traditional food, getting lots and lots of cuddles. We can actually transfer a lot of our microbes to each other. So dancing, touching, laughing, sharing drinks if the person is healthy. These kind of things can be very, very helpful.
So it sounded like there's a difference there between somebody who is born C-section versus the antibiotics. It sounded like the latter was less serious and they may still have some remnants in there that they can repopulate.
Yes.
Did I catch that right? Yeah.
Accurate. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So how often, obviously, if we're C-section, we're not going to get the microbes to start. How different is that microbiome for somebody who is born C-section? Because I'm assuming there's still some microbes there.
It is. It is.
And then I want to give some hope. You've already talked a little bit about what we can do, but for that person, what we can do to bring ourselves back on track best we can.
Yes. It is night and day different. So in the studies looking at the natural microbiome versus natural birth microbiome versus C-section microbiome, the C-section is primarily populated, that person's microbiome, by the doctors in the hospital and whoever is touching it. So we're getting a lot more skin, a lot more pathogens and overgrowth. So skin microbes, not necessarily the good ones, right? Because doctors are constantly having to sterilize themselves. So we really want a lot of something called Staph E, Staph epidermis. It's a very beneficial microbe for skin. We're meant to get it from our mothers and fathers and our family, but not many people have it on their skin now. And so we get more of the Staph A and the MRSA and these kind of things. So the babies are being born with a lot more overgrowth, and it's not an insurmountable thing, but it is becoming that way, especially with second generation. So what we see is a lack of the microbes that produce oxytocin for us. And if you look at especially a lot of our mental illnesses like autism, we're really missing the microbes that produce oxytocin, which is our bonding hormone, right? So there's quite a trickle down, and what can be done is pay attention to what I'm putting out, honestly. I've found some solutions, so have some other people, and we're working steadily on it. A bulk of this year, I was putting 18 hours a day on this to try to stabilize some of these microbes, because the issue with a lot of the birth microbes is that they're anaerobes. And anaerobe means that it dies in the presence of oxygen. So you can't put it into a supplement, right? You've got to handle it in a glass box. So working on stabilizing it is something that a lot of us are working on doing. Others are collecting traditional stool for good fecal transplants, which right now, for those of you who are familiar with fecal transplants in centers, most of them just screen for pathogens, but they don't screen for birth microbes. And we really need those birth microbes. So yeah, I would say those are the ways of the future. I do think, though, we have a window of time right now where this can be fixed. We're not in a doomsday situation, but we are in a hustle situation to prevent that.
Somebody tuning in today, in the future, they're in a situation where they're having a baby. A C-section is warranted. They need to have it done. They don't want to have it done, but they got to do what they have to do. What would you have them do in that situation to try and preserve the microbiome for that new child best they can?
That happens a lot. A lot of women don't want it, and then they get forced into it. So in that situation, we want to plant a microbe called L. fermentum CEC. It's one of the microbes that regrows the mucosal layer, and it's something you can get on Amazon if you live in America and some of the other countries. And she can sprinkle it on her nipple and have the child feed from that, along with a little HMO, which is what feeds that microbe. That will go a long way, because that is the microbe that is meant to build that mucosa. And without that mucosa, the other birth microbes won't plant, even once we've discovered how to stabilize them, or to transport them. So I would start with that. And then I would also work on a lot of, this is going to sound funny, but parasympathetic activity for the mother. So things that bring oxytocin and joy to her. Our microbes are deeply affected by our states. And I would use a lot of light and circadian timing because our microbiome is as affected by light as it is by food. So I would start with that. And then after a month or so, then you might be able to start planting some other microbes in. Like if the child is having, say, eczema or histamine issues, you can use L-Plantarum 299V. It's a very antihistamine microbe. But note, I should say that if anyone just goes shopping for L-Plantarum, you're going to see so many. Many don't say 299V after it. There's over 20 L-Plantarums, and each one does different things. So the number after it is crucial. And if it doesn't have a number, I don't recommend buying it.
Talk more about that piece, because it's going to be applicable for a lot of what we're talking about today, where somebody is going to go and buy these microbes. It's not just L-Plantarum and you're good there. Like you said, you want to see that number and you want to know what number to look for. So talk about that full name and what each piece represents.
So let's take, I break this down in a blog. I don't have many blogs. So if you go to my website, I do break it down into what each part of the name means. But let's take L-fermentum that I was just talking about, the CEC. That one is building your mucosa. That one is making a home for the good microbes in your body. If you get L-fermentum Me3, which is a favorite one of mine, and which I have cursed the world with by mentioning on a podcast a year ago because it has now been sold out for an entire year. No one can get it. Someone talk to Estonia, where it comes from, for them to produce more, please. The L-fermentum Me3, that one boosts glutathione. If you look at the percentages of how it boosts glutathione, you can't get an IV that does that. Nothing else does that. And it also removes metals from the body. So like if you've had trouble wearing earrings that aren't gold, or if you have nickel allergies, or if you have a lot of mercury, L-fermentum's Me3 is the microbe that helps to remove it, right? So totally different than rebuilding the mucosa. Now, we could also go into the microbes that have good and bad, like strep, right? Strep has wonderful ones that we absolutely need. And then it has a lot that give people pandas and PANS, which is the condition where you can't sleep. You are Jekyll and Hyde, you are moody, and honestly, even if you were a Buddhist monk beforehand, you will be a nightmare to be around and a nightmare to be in your body. So it goes and munches all your melatonin and pre-melatonin, so you can't make your feel-good chemicals and you can't sleep. So there's really different ranges of these, and the way that you can tell what it is the number after it.
Okay, so coming back to our example there, somebody that had to have a C-section, you've mentioned a specific bacteria that they can put on the nipple. If they do that within a certain period of time after birth, is that going to take hold like if they were born vaginally?
That one can. So if you also put it with HMO, which should be coming in the milk, but our milk is very different now, especially if a woman has had a C-section, she too has had IV antibiotics. We have to remember. And IV antibiotics are much stronger than oral antibiotics. They wipe out a lot more. So in that case, it's likely that it will colonize.
Okay. What other microbes would they want to add in? I'm assuming it's not just the one. So this baby hasn't been through the vagina. They're not inoculated in a healthy way. What's the full gamut that mom and dad would want to consider?
So I'm actually outlining that now. I'm working on that for the public right now. I'm putting it in the order of what they can do along with what's available on the market and what food it needs. So I'll have that for everyone in the not too near future. Really. And I'm really trying to get this to families immediately so that they can start to right this wrong because no one knew about the microbiome. So our birth practices came out of a lack of knowledge, right? I mean, it wasn't even 4 years ago when the medical community was saying that there was no microbiome of the womb. And turns out, of course, there is. Of course there is. So you can still do the swipe, but the swipe is not sufficient. It's not sufficient. It's better than doing nothing, but it's not sufficient. The mother, before giving birth, of course, she won't know if it's going to be C-section or not. Um, her building up her microbiome is a very important thing, and same with the dad, actually, and of the household. So they can be wearing natural fibers. They can be using probiotics for the mouth, like I'm going to plug a brand and they don't plug me, so I just want to make that clear. But the Bliss probiotics is spelled with one S. It repopulates the mouth and the throat with the appropriate microbes. So then when you're kissing the baby, they can get that. That is how they're supposed to get it. There's supposed to be a lot of kissing, And so you can start to build that up. You can use probiotic skin creams. They're starting to come out with more and more. I'm working on those as well. I think anyone in my field is trying to get as many probiotic products out as possible for the public to use with the right microbes. And there's a lot developing there. Yeah.
You mentioned quickly there the vaginal swab, which is something I was going to bring up and I've heard of. If they do what you mentioned before with that specific strain on the nipple, is it worth still doing the swab as well? And explain what you mean by the swab for people that don't know.
Oh, yes. Thank you. So it started to become a more common practice that for women that had C-sections or didn't want the C-section and had it, that a doctor or a midwife would come in and swab the vaginal canal and then cover the baby in the vaginal fluid. Now, I still think it's worth doing because we have had a lot of hubris in the medical community, and it's possible that something might take hold. You never know. So I would say do the swab anyway. But it was really kind of sold as or promoted as, hey, as long as you get a swab, it's the same. Your baby's going to be fine. And the microbiomes are not the same of those babies, but there's still a chance. And I think with more and more of the knowledge that those of us in the field are putting out about how to feed these microbes, because we have to think of these little guys as one, our little friends, and two, like houseplants, you have to feed them. So, so just during the swab, if then it's not fed properly, they die. Right? They're just, they die. So we have to feed them as well. And so as we start educating the public more, and as hopefully more of my writing can get out on this exact subject, then people can make more preventative measures, and maybe the swab will be more valuable than it is now. So I would still do the swab just in case things are going into hibernation, which the birth microbes like to do.
Okay, you talked about feeding them there. For a baby, I assume that's just breast milk. Talk about for a C-section baby or a baby that's vaginally birthed, how much of the microbiome gets built from being breastfed?
A lot. Yeah, it's far more important than it's been given gravitas for. And in fact, the longer you can go, the more important. So like the 2 year is really good because some of these microbes, let's say everything went perfect. Okay, let's say we're in my tribes and the lady gives birth and she starts nursing her babe. Now the babe would have been seeded with all of these birth microbes, and many of them will actually go dormant for 6 months to a year. You won't see any of them active, but they still need that breast milk, and they're waiting for their life cycle because when they are valuable is a year in. Right. And so they need to get fed then. And that's when they start blossoming and doing other things for the baby. So, which lead to a whole lifetime of health or ill health. So the breast milk is incredibly important. And there's lots of different kinds of what's called HMO, which feed different ones. So I give you just a general HMO for the L fermentum, but there's multiple different ones. And, we don't have to know all the science if we just do it the old fashioned way. Right? We just feed the babe, which I realize some can't latch. And I'm not excusing or writing off all the reasons why everyone can't nurse. But I do think this is why we always had wet nurses, right? Wet nurses were very important because we really can't replicate, not yet, what nature can create. So that breast milk is incredibly important. I think I don't want to quote the wrong number, but I think it's about 80% to answer your question.
Okay. So far, vaginal birth, breastfeeding, those are ideal. You mentioned this oral probiotic that parents can take, kissing the baby. For young kids, let's stick here. What are the other things that we can do during the early years to support the microbiome?
You want to touch them a lot if you're healthy, because we do share our microbiome with those in our house. And so, our kind of modern society of throwing the kids to childcare and them mixing up with a lot of sick kids and being around a lot of people that eat very differently and all that kind of thing, that's a part of society. So, I don't want to make people feel like they have to change their life, but it's not ideal for the microbiome, right? For the microbiome, the safety checks that we had historically, generationally, and traditionally for the last thousands of years was that if for some reason you lost one of these very important microbes, you'd usually get it back through sharing food with your family and cuddling with your family and all of that kind of thing. Because traditionally we didn't sleep alone in beds, right? We didn't eat with forks and knives. We ate with our hands. And so we had a lot more bacterial transmission. Now that was actually more safe. Now we have a lot more microbial transmission that's not as smart, like sleeping around with people, kissing lots of people, hands in elevators, like all of those kind of things, right? That we were all made to be kind of afraid of in the 80s and 90s. But we are actually designed to change our little universe with each other and keep us all elevated and healthy.
So it sounds like there's two challenges there. One, we're not doing the practices where we get the good microbes from each other. And two, we're getting bad ones on top of that.
That is correct.
Given that, other than having people, which we can't necessarily control, that are healthy in our proximity, what are some of the things we can do to optimize and protect against those two areas?
So that's what I'm working on. I've spent the last year, I think right around when we talked last, I was charting out the entire birth microbiome and what each microbe does, what vitamins it produces, what pathogens it blocks, what pathogens it can work as an antagonist against, what antibiotic kills it, so that if you have an antibiotic, you know what you need to replant, right? And what food it needs. So I've been charting all of this out. So as soon as I get more time, you all will have that info. And then you can very elegantly replace these things. But in the meantime, the best thing you can do until more of this information gets out there is genuinely try to reduce your stress load a lot. And that means eating at the same time, waking at the same time, dancing, cuddling, doing the things that everyone doesn't think are important, right? People think you need to go lift at the gym. Walking and dancing are far more effective for a lot of what I'm talking about. Eye contact is important. Having deep relationships is important. These kind of things can kind of override the lack that we're having. So they can work on the immune system in different channels to help support you. Of course, eating more low carb. You don't have to be ketogenic or fully low carb, but carb spikes. If whatever you're eating is spiking your blood sugar, then it's too much for you personally, right? Because then the immune system is suppressed for 48 hours. So doing things like that so that you're not picking up as much is a good idea. And then you can use things like olive oil soap that don't kill the good microbes on your skin, but do kill the pathogens. So you're still addressing that, right? Or you can take some of the traditional practices that are around the world. And that is that, like, when you're going around cities and places like that, instead of using all the antimicrobial stuff on your hands all the time, you can just use your left hand for everything that is dirty, right? Right hand for eating. There's lots of cultures that do that.
All right, let's come back to antibiotics. If somebody needs them legitimately, whether they're a kid or an adult, again, they've already come to this conversation, so they're aware. What would you do in that situation ahead of time, during, and after? And by what you said before, I know there's some specific here that we don't necessarily have the data for, but where we're at now, what's the best we can do?
Maybe I should just put my antibiotic guide out there. I have an antibiotic guide for my clients, and I could just post it. So I've mapped out the most common 10 targeted antibiotics versus broad spectrum versus IV antibiotics. So you can look up, like I was prescribed Cipro. So these are the birth microbes that it's going to wipe out, and this is where you can get them, kind of thing. So that is coming. I've already done it. I just haven't released it. So we have that information. I really think our pharmacies of the future could be very elegant if this is brought in, because let's say you have staph and you go to the hospital, or actually, yeah, let's use staph. You go to the hospital, maybe you're going to sepsis. We'll know what microbes you're missing, what birth microbes. And sometimes when you hit it enough, and I had an example of this earlier this year for my own self. If you hit it hard enough, you can actually get at it with the probiotics and never have to use the antibiotics, right? So I'll give you my personal example, which is a little different. Right after I talked with you last year, I moved into the house that I had rented. And I just moved back to the States, and I got a furnished place because I was non-committal. I wasn't sure where I was going to be. But it was beautiful. And the house had an infestation, which is very rare of this one, of brown recluse spiders. And they had just hatched, and they were in my bed. And I got 21 brown recluse bites. Yeah. So for those of you who are international, those are very deadly spider bites. What I did was I took Plantarum 299V, which is the microbe that is the antagonist to that toxin. And I took it every hour. So my bites still went into necrosis, but I didn't have to spend a month or two in the hospital. So what's coming is a very different form of medicine where we can use the benefits of nature against these pathogens. But let's say you get there too late, or you don't have that knowledge. So they give you the antibiotic, then you can replant. So what you can do until this knowledge is common and it's out there is I would immediately go and take probably the antihistamine probiotics afterwards. So I've already given you one. Plantarum 299V is a good one. The L-fermentum is another really good one to start with. And I might bring in a soil, like an HU58, which kills a lot of the mucus eaters, like the staph and the strep. And if I was a naturally born person, then I might bring in like there's a really good soil microbe. It's a mix of them. I'll grab it for your listeners. I'll grab it for you. It tends to work very well to kind of restart those birth microbes. And finally, I would feed them. So once the antibiotic course is over, I would be doing the arabinogalactin and the acacia and all of that kind of stuff to make sure they were properly fed. If any were left, they could come back.
You've already touched on this now a couple times with the lower carb and now feeding the microbes here. What does that look like? Let's just zoom back a bit here and feeding the microbiome on a regular basis. What does the ideal look like?
Yeah, this might catch some waves, I'll be honest, because it's not what's popular right now. So many people have gotten so sick with these chronic illnesses and had to go on really strict diets, and it is their survival, right? And I certainly understand that. I teach them, and I had to go on one myself. So I'm not telling anyone here to change their diet, but the diet for the birth microbes is very different than what I'm seeing around. It is more similar to what I see in a lot of the tribal regions and kind of across the globe. So things that are amazing for the birth microbes are things like green plantain starch is amazing for them, right? That's a very common food kind of belted around the world, and it feeds a broad range of the birth microbes. So if you're healthy enough, you can have those, right? Now, lots of people are going to have to stick to steak and they just can't. But if you can, that's great. And now, really, I'm really not teaching gaps, really. Because people's mucosa is so collapsed. So I've created a new system where I'm giving little bits of the birth microbes. I'm bringing the histamines down and then doing the foods for the microbes. But to answer a question that I would imagine is percolating in the minds of listeners and watchers is what about the carnivore tribes, right? Because they don't need green plantain or anything like that. And that is correct. They don't. They're healthy as can be. It's very different when you're born into a natural microbiome. You live in a natural environment and you're constantly sharing that versus our current society. So I still teach carnivore, but I am screening for the mucosal collapse and things like that. So a good diet for the birth microbes would be funny things like hibiscus tea. And so some of them need polyphenols like hibiscus tea. Some of them need shrimp shells. Some of them need odd parts of animals. Some definitely need dairy and parts of dairy. Some need a lot need, actually, a form of resistant starch, tiny, tiny amounts. We're not talking about a whole cup. We're talking about like a quarter of a teaspoon. It does a lot. So things like that. And you see them all around the world. So I can speak to like the regional diets of the different places I go. Acacia fiber is just massive. It's a big one in many parts of Africa that I go to. But I would say by and large, the most common one that I see around is green plantain.
Okay, I want to make sure I understand this because a lot of people are going to be curious. What differentiates somebody who does better on green plantain versus carnivore? Is it the fact that if they've damaged their microbiome, carnivore is next best? And then if they still have their original birth microbes, they want to feed them with the plantain? Get into the nuance there.
Yeah, so this is a spicy subject, but we're going to get into it. I'm not going to get fans from this. So I'm going to tell you guys, what's going on. So when I was first practicing, carnivore was magic, especially for MCAD, histamine disorders, schizophrenia. It was a slam dunk. But it was not something that people had to stay on. And now, even famous cases, you see lots of famous cases, people are kind of stuck on it. And they may not feel stuck. They're grateful to feel better, right? So I don't mean to downplay the incredible achievements that they have gotten, but it is unusual that they can't move off. Usually that lack of a movement where they can't eat other foods again, or where they become more and more sensitive, they have to do more and more fasting, they can eat less and less foods, that has to do far more with a lack of the birth microbes and the mucin eaters more than anything else. Because let's say you have chronic strep, it is eating your mucin down. And since no one ever talks about mucin, let's have a little nerdy class about mucin. Do you guys want to hear about mucin?
Definitely.
Okay, so when you lack mucin, when your mucin is in a collapse, right, this never-ending story, nothing that we're seeing of a mucosal collapse, histamines are through the roof. So the classic histamine disorders of you're producing too much or you're not clearing, the methods for that aren't working because the production is coming from the imbalance in the mucosa. And same thing with our sex hormones. So everyone's injecting their hormones, right? And doing these different things. But if you have mucosal collapse because you have Klebsiella, just, having a buffet on your mucosa every day, then your sex hormones are going to be extremely off. You can present as a female, you can present as too little estrogen or too much. You can present as fully perimenopausal, like Karen style. And as a man, you can present with almost no testosterone, right? Or too much estrogen. And so your histamines are through the roof. You're not balancing your hormones and your feel-good chemicals are getting blocked along with your melatonin. And you know why the melatonin is getting blocked?
No.
It's so cool. Melatonin is extremely antimicrobial, extremely. And these smart little microbes know that. So if you have this little cluster of these mucin eaters that don't get starved out on the medical diets, they will go in and eat the precursors to the melatonin because the melatonin will kill them. So these people can't sleep. And no limbic exercise is going to beat that. Sorry, folks. You got to get the bugs.
So when it comes to getting these bugs that are affecting this mucin layer, do we see those in the tests that you were talking about early on?
Yeah, the GI map, definitely. Some of them you see them, some of them you don't. A lot of the microbial testing will not tell you the number or the type of microbe. It'll just say strep, and you don't know if it's the beneficial or the pathogenic or the opportunistic. So I like GI map right now. I may change if more brands come out. Um, but right now I like GI map because at least for the major players, you can see if it's the goodies or the baddies.
Okay, and then when it comes to treating them, if you have the bad ones, to me, there would likely be two different ways of approaching that: bringing in certain good guys to push them out and kill them, or using something that's antimicrobial. Talk about what that looks like.
So what I like to do, and I do a different thing based on the level of mucosal collapse, but I'll bring in, I've charted out the microbial antagonists that work for all of these. And so some will produce actually like killing things against the pathogen or pseudopathogen. Others will take over the land space in the body, so push it out. Others neutralize the toxin. So I'll usually bring in a probiotic that's going to act as a probiotic or a beneficial microbial antagonist. So it's going to go to war for you. It's going to kill that little guy. Now, some of them have very strong biofilms, some don't, but a lot of the ones I see do. So I'll bring in an appropriate biofilm burster for that. And that's very often something that's commonly used in other situations. It's the timing in which it's had. And then if it's something like the Shiga toxin E. coli or something that produces a toxin and the toxin is the biggest problem, then we bring in a toxin neutralizer as well. So like for Shiga toxin, which this isn't going to be very relevant, not that many people get that kind of food poisoning, but if you get the Shiga toxin, Saccharomyces boulardii binds to that toxin and pulls it out of the body, preventing the damage to the body. So it's always a one-prong approach at least, and then sometimes two. I almost never use antimicrobials, almost never. There are exceptions, like to Pseudomonas. I'll use both, but yeah.
Let's come back to biofilms. Talk about what those are and give some examples of different things that you use to break through them.
So biofilms are, if you think of a castle, the biofilm is the moat that protects the castle from invading armies. So biofilms are what the microbes create to hide from the immune system, to hide from the tests, and to proliferate. Right? They're very sticky. They can go into unusual places. So if you take Enterococcus, someone could have a chronic kidney infection with Enterococcus in their urine, which is smell. Their partners will notice it, but they keep going back to the doctors, and the doctor is like, "You're fine," because they're testing for 4 microbes. But Enterococcus is not one of the ones they test for, right? So it's sticking there with its biofilms. Biofilms are very sticky. One of the things that helps to get at Enterococcus biofilms is hibiscus tea, but not everyone can do this, of course. I just do it for pleasure. So biofilms are a way that the microbes protect themselves, and some of the microbes have gotten stronger biofilms, and in fact, some will get stronger biofilms in relation to your environment, and this is something important to know. So many of these microbes don't like black mold and some of the other toxic molds to humans. So if you already have some of these overgrowths and then you move into a moldy environment, your microbes will actually get stronger, the pathogens and the mucus eating, yeah, because they're protecting themselves from the mold. And so they'll get fierce biofilms around them. And so that's where people can just feel like they're never going to get better, right? Everything affects them and they're going to have to live in the desert in a tent. That's where we get that from. And the feeling is accurate because that's what they're experiencing. But the way to go about it is strategy. You need strategy for that. So different microbes, the biofilms require different things. So it's too intricate to go into here, but I'll say my favorite in general is using NAC, because I don't see a lot of die-off from that. I don't see a lot of bad from it. And most people have it in their house already. Someone's recommended it for liver health. They're cleansing. It's very inexpensive. It's the way you take it, though, that makes it appropriate for biofilms. So if you take it first thing in the morning, or just at least an hour away from other supplements, probiotics, foods, electrolytes and water are fine, but no medications, then it can get at the biofilms. And then an hour later, then you can bring in your little military to take care of the things. And that tends to work extremely well. So it's not going to work for all microbes. They do have specific ones, but that's your safest bet.
All right, I want to make sure we cover this in detail. And obviously, it's going to depend on the case and what's going on. But for somebody out there who can't afford or doesn't have access to the testing, we now know the NAC is part of this. But there's 3 different parts. There's also the toxins and then the bacteria or microbes. So what would a full protocol look like in a general sense to go in there and bust things up, if you can give that? Because obviously, again, it's very different depending on the case.
That would actually be a book. That would be a book. But I am working on that for you guys. I am. I've been writing it all year. So because I'm trying to get this to households that don't have the money for testing, because that's just the reality of it. And there is a way you can go about it to act as if. But I actually wouldn't start with NAC. I would start with feeding the birth microbes first, so you have some immunity, and getting lots of daylight, laughter, dancing. Then I would bring in, and real food, right? So your meat, your fish, what have you, real fats, but not too high. Not too high. If you've got the mucin eaters, actually less ketosis. You know I'm a fan of ketosis, but like streptococcus and ketosis are not buds. They're not buds. So more traditional diet, lots of touch, lots of laughter, lots of dance, feed the birth microbes, and then start planting. And you plant them with their food, like the L-fermentum with the HMO. And then you could go in with the NAC, maybe like a month or 2 later, and start to kind of rebuild. In general, if you go to the supplement store and a microbe has the numbers after it, you'll be able to look up a lot of the benefits for it. So you can see what you might be benefiting from and what might be good to plant for you.
Okay, just to make sure we're comprehensive here, you mentioned feeding the birth microbes. What does that look like again, specifically?
Yeah, I know this is a whole new big topic, and this is not something the public or most of the field knows about, but those are the different foods that are like arabinogalactin, shrimp shells. So in many parts of the world, they grind up shrimp shells or crawfish shells as well, and they use it as a seasoning. That's one of the foods for the birth microbes. A lot of the dairy things are simply because of breast milk, right, and HMO. There's different foods that you can get that are non-dairy, of course, because not all cultures consume dairy, and large arabinogalactans. So, like when I was at the Sami a couple years ago, the Sami are traditional folk up in the Nordic parts of Sweden and Norway and Finland and Russia. They drink and they use the bark of the larch tree and of the birch tree, right? So a lot of traditional cultures use the barks, and the barks actually have a lot of the foods for the birth microbes. So those are some things like green plantain resistant starch. I don't recommend potato or corn resistant starch, but the more natural forms, those kind of things.
Okay. Before we move forward, in the most simplest form, somebody who's an adult right now, even with what you just shared, there's a lot of different substrates. What can this look like? Somebody who, again, can't afford or doesn't have access to testing, but they want to prioritize their gut health. They're an adult. They've lived a pretty conventional life. What does that look like, simplifying best you can? I know it's complicated, but with all the different strains and numbers and different substrates to feed, could be overwhelming for somebody, and they might just throw in the towel and not try what we're talking about. So let's try and simplify it best we can to at least get them started exactly what they need here.
Yeah, I don't know if I can right now because I'm simplifying it for myself. So this isn't, I would say this is really different than our other ones in that I'm introducing what's being created right now to solve a very major problem, because it's not just our gut health. Every organ has a microbiome, and it affects everything. So this is really an introduction to what we can do. And what most of my work has been is in collecting these microbes and then making this into a digestible tool, content, knowledge for you all to use. But it's not out yet because this is a lot of work on my end. So I don't have the simple solution for you yet. What I want you to know is that this is we're not at a lost mission. We have a window of time to fix it, and we are working on it, and it's coming out. But the reality is, sometimes when we've created enormous destruction to a system we weren't aware of, the coming back from it is not easy, and it's not simple, and it's not three things. And we could look at politics, for instance, right? When there's a revolution, everyone thinks, yay, it's going to be new. And then the new regime is like awful, and you have to rebuild the whole country and all the buildings are gone. We're doing that with our bodies right now. We're rebuilding after a lot of medical damage, unbeknownst and without purpose. So a lot of this is rebuilding. So really, and just for your information, fun tidbits, because these microbes are amazing, and and they're our friends. They're our little friends. So the best thing you can do right now is stop the killing when appropriate, right? So if you have a sinus infection, personally, I wouldn't take an antibiotic, right? If it's something deadly, of course, and that's just for myself. You need to make your own choices. But keep an eye out for more products coming to the line to help the microbiome of the skin, of the nasal passages, of the mouth, and test them out for yourselves. And in the meantime, actually, I do have one thing that you can do for sure. The You can, if you can do yogurt or even coconut yogurt, a lot of the strains, the birth strains that we've been able to isolate and turn into a supplement, we can cultivate into a yogurt. So you can save a ton of money by buying one bottle and then cultivating that strain into a yogurt. Dr. William Davis teaches in his book how to do that with Ruddick yogurt, but you could use that same recipe with the other microbes. So that would be a way that would be very affordable to start repopulating. And the best part is that in the nature of feeding that microbe in the yogurt, so, he has you use inulin, you feed the microbe in the yogurt. So you don't have to think about also feeding the microbe. Now, some countries are ahead of us. Like if you go to Korea, they have row upon row upon row of medical yogurt in the yogurt aisles. I mean, there's like 8 yogurt aisles. They're gargantuan, and they are allowed to say what it is for. And in the lid, it has the little food for the microbe, and then you drink the yogurt, and it helps to replant. So most countries are ahead of us in this, right? So, yes, yeah. But right now, the main thing is to stop the damage as much as possible, boost the oxytocin, get back to traditional ways as much as possible, because there's so much about the body that we don't know, and our hubris has hurt us more than it's helped us. So, I do that.
Well, let's talk about protecting what we do have then. We've talked about antibiotics, clothing. What are the biggest insults on a day-to-day basis us here in the West maybe don't even know about that are having this negative impact on our microbiome?
I would say plastics in the house are a really big one, because that's an inhaled. So you mentioned polyester, like when we wear polyester, but our furniture, our carpet, our paint, right? A lot of this is plastic, and those microplastics are inhaled, and it's very difficult to get those out, and they really do damage the microbiome. I've written a couple just like fun blogs. When I have some free time, I'll do that. And I've done a series on the fabrics in the house and that kind of thing, and what microbes affect it. So you're welcome to read those. But that would be a big one. Another one would be to get outside. I can't tell you how hard it is. I mean, to get people outside. I don't know if there's any other practitioners out there. It is really hard to get people outside. And it's not necessarily for lack of them wanting to go outside, but their jobs command them to be at a computer, and then they also have kids and they have to drive places. But this indoor living is a huge problem for the microbiome. It also doesn't help with all the mold issues that we have, right? If you look at houses in the Florida Keys, they have a lot more airflow. Same amount of mold as in Miami, but the Miami houses have far more problems because of the lack of airflow. So airflow is pretty important, right? And we have closed houses, unless you're one of those lucky ones who lives in the South, and you open your doors. It's so nice. But yeah, so I would say those things, and our breathing rate is a big one. Most of us don't think about breathing, but the rate at which we breathe, the speed at which we breathe, affects what we can detox, moves our microbiome. That's another big one. And then light and sound, because light and sound are a large part of how the microbiome moves, right? Drums can command fungi under the forest and all sorts of magical things.
You've told that story before on the show. Very
yeah,
cool.
Exactly. That's exactly it. Yeah. Yeah. So trying not to use the fake stuff as much as possible. Like either don't wear jewelry or wear gold or silver. Um, uh, Replacing one thing at a time so it's not overwhelming, and having grace with yourself because we've all been born into this stew, and having as much fun as possible while doing it because laughter really is the most important medicine. So, this whole thing is a real comedy of errors that we're in right now.
I agree. What about herbicides, pesticides, glyphosate in that realm? How big of an issue are those when it comes to the microbiome?
They're a really big issue, but they're a bigger issue because we have certain microbes that should be removing those, and we're losing those microbes. So with heavy metals, with herbicides, we do have protection that does come within us if we are born and raised naturally and fed in the right cycle. So it's not a doomsday. In fact, when I get someone who's been harmed by one of those, we'll start planting some of the microbes that can help process those out of the body and handle those. So yeah, there's a way forward with that.
Okay, and I know there's keystone species. I believe Alrhodera that you talked about is one of those.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because it can be so daunting to think about this 200 microbe
yeah.
burst stew that hopefully we're born through.
Mm.
If we start working on some of the keystone ones, does that often have a trickle-down effect?
It does. Yeah, they help each other actually. Yes. So they come in little packs, just like the little pseudopathogens do. And so if you don't have, in fact, this is how some of the carnivore tribes do so well with their microbiome. Because if one of the birth microbes doesn't have its normal food, some of the other birth microbes, if they're there, can actually provide the food for it. And so they maintain that healthy microbiome. So the more of the birth microbes you have, the less trouble you have because they help each other. They volley each other up.
Let's come back to the carnivore piece. I feel like there's still some details we got to hash out in that realm. There's the green plantain, which can be a good thing feeding the microbiome. There's a lot of people doing the carnivore thing saying no plants at all. Talk about how you see that now. You did get into it, but I feel like, again, we have to hash it out more. Is it that carnivore can be good for people in the beginning, and then things like green plantain over time are essential when the healing's been done to get to that next level?
Yeah, what I would say now with the current mucosal collapse, which is very different than 10, 15 years ago, but with the current mucosal collapse, ideally you would get a GI map done so that you can see if you have these mucosal eaters. Because if you have the mucosal eaters, or if you're lacking the birth microbes, you're likely to be one of the ones stuck on the diet that can't move on. And the histamines are still an issue and you have to do lots of fasting, right? So this isn't against the carnivore diet. It's a strategy where you can go in a bit smarter. So if you know that those things are a factor, then you can start addressing them from the beginning, and you can start with tiny sprinkles of things, right? A lot of times, and I work with the most sensitive of the most sensitive, people that really cannot do anything with food or lifestyle. I mean, really everything affects them. So supplements are out, and of course vegetables are out and all of that. But with the birth microbial food, you can do a pinprick. right? You don't need what we think of as a serving. These microbes can eat very little amounts of things. And so even if what we're using we think of as small, like 1/32 of a teaspoon, if you're having a reaction to that, do a 32nd of that. Do even less, because the birth microbes can live on that. And so you can do tiny little strategic amounts while you get the benefit of the carnivore diet or the other medical diets, because those are, I wouldn't have healed without those diets, right? Those diets are amazing. But as our microbiome has shifted, new things are needed. We have a new generation of microbiomes. And so for some, those will still work like it did for me. And for others, it won't. And what I'm seeing in even the natural health communities, in the uh, dietary communities, is a lot of people being told at the year, 2 year mark, well, you haven't done it hard enough. You didn't do it right. You clearly missed this. You need to do it much longer. When very often they have a species of microbe that's eating their mucosa and causing havoc. And so I think it's wise to be looking at the birth microbes, making sure we're not starving those out. I think that's only responsible. And at this point, with what we know now, and feed those little guys, and then address any mucosal eaters. So you can do them at the same time. You can still use the diets plus that. But I wouldn't go in blindly right now.
For somebody on an all meat diet, they feel like they could introduce, say, the plantain fiber, but they're feeling good on what they're on. What I want to make sure we get to here is there additional benefit, or is there a certain longevity to that diet for that person for them to start including some of this?
Different things work for different folks. So always go with what feels best. Always. Don't let me talk you out of anything. But, on paper, logically, the birth microbes have a time span that they can live without their foods. And so if you feel really great, keep doing what you're doing. But if it were me, with the knowledge that I now have and that I will get to as soon as I can, I would put sprinkles in. It doesn't mean you have to eat a handful of something, but sprinkles daily to keep those birth microbes alive, because those make our feel-good chemicals. They produce our vitamins for us, which allows us to not have to eat a varied diet. They produce minerals for us and all sorts of things. They fight pathogens and they help us sleep. They do all the things that we are wanting. So they're rather important, so I would try to keep those alive if at all possible.
Whether it be from an extreme elimination diet like a carnivore diet or fasting, can you see benefit in the short term by using those to starve off a lot of the bad guys and then using that as a springboard to move towards what you're talking about now?
I used to, and that's what I always taught. I'm just seeing less of that with the mucosal collapse. Yeah, because the mucosal collapse is a whole new thing that we're dealing with. Yeah, but in general, yes, I've always seen it as a cast. You do those so that you can restabilize the microbiome. The issue is that was in the days of beneficial, opportunistic, and pathogenic microbes. And we're finding that there's other groups, like mucin eaters, that we didn't have to deal with before. And now we're really dealing with a lot of them. So it's just in flux right now.
And does this, I assume it does, tie back to your change of thoughts about the GAPS diet?
Completely, because it doesn't take these into account at all. And so it can starve out the birth microbes while letting these really eat your mucosa. And so, I've just seen that be utterly ignored. And I think it's a lot cheaper to get one GI map than to go through 2 years of why am I not getting better?
And by the sounds of it, these microbes are relatively new for us. Where did they come from?
They're from a lot of things. Like I've seen a lot of people get them from raw milk. Raw milk is a either a superfood or a deadly food, depending on how it's handled. It has to be handled with great respect. The tribes I go to handle it with great respect. I've seen a lot of places not handle it with respect. Now, those are not in America. America has such strict laws. Oh my gosh, our dairies are amazing. Yeah, we're good. We're good. They would get shut down so fast. But I have seen terrible things in the UK. I have seen some terrible things. And so people will go and get what they think is very good, a superfood, right? With the vitamins and the things that we're missing, the vitamin A and the D and the K, and end up with pseudomonas and Shiga toxin E. coli and staph and all the things from the milk. So don't just know your farmer if you're outside of America. Go and look at the facilities and make sure you're sterilizing and doing things appropriately. Make sure there's no chickens around. All right, cross contamination is a thing, but but so a lot of them come that way. It can also be from our weakened immune systems due to our microbiome collapse, but also just our environment and the light exposure. So a child can pick up strep as they do, and instead of getting throat infection, it can go into the nervous system, go chronic. Now we're seeing that in adults. I see that in a lot of adults. So again, that speaks to immune suppression, quite a bit of that. And also a lack of the beneficial microbes that protect against that. So, so it's pretty easy to pick these up. And then travel. Travel, right? Street food and fresh water when traveling. Absolutely.
When it comes to our microbes as a whole, there's bacteria, viruses, parasites. How do you look at that whole orchestra and others, if there are that I haven't mentioned, and what we want to do to assess and work with all of that in a healthy way?
Oh, great question. So I usually like to take someone's full history. Like, I want to know the infections they had when they were 3 and 7, because that's going to show me what they were already missing in their microbiome, right? For them to get those infections. So, like, if they had tuberculosis, I know they're missing Rhamnosus GG from the get go, and they haven't picked that up somewhere. So, I would go way back to that. Viruses, usually people have tested for and they know if they have them or not. There's some exceptions. I always look at where they travel and their familial history. And like some things get really missed, like leptospirosis. I catch a lot of that. So there's some things that get missed. And then for parasites, if I want to rule that out, I always use the same guy. He's a parasitologist. He tests much more than the stool. So we'll look there. But we still look at cytokines. So if you want to get a clearer picture, you can do a cytokine panel, which is different branches of the immune system. So there's inflammatory cytokines and anti-inflammatory cytokines. And if you're not sure, like let's say you show up with a parasite, but it's not specific which one it is, like or let's even just say an amoeba, right? Then you can look at your cytokine panel and your travel history and narrow it down pretty well as to what you might be dealing with. So there's ways to sleuth that take a lot of time on my end to do. But there's ways to get down there and kind of like look into and see what's going on. So that's kind of how I go about it.
But sometimes are these other microbes, along with the bacteria, part of a healthy microbiome?
Absolutely. Yeah. So we have so many beneficial fungi, and we have really beneficial microbes. So it's, the mistake that I think we made around the 40s through the 90s of like antibiotics and sterilization and all of this was that we, one, lost a lot of the traditional important methods of like keeping raw milk clean. Okay. But, and then we killed a lot of the microbiome without knowing what it was. But we also looked at all these microbes as bad. And I'm seeing right now two camps, and both are problematic. I see the one that we all know about, which is the microbes are bad, OCD, let's clean everything, right? We all know that one. But equally, and I'm even seeing it in my field, I'm seeing what I think is actually very unhealthy, and that is that all microbes are friendly. Let me tell you, all microbes are not friendly at all. Quite the opposite. So we have ones that are our best friends, and we have ones that should not be in our microbiome. And we do need to be mindful of. The tribes are mindful of them. They avoid them through tradition and through reverence. So, if you're one of those folks who wants to go and start a homestead, I would say really learn how things were done in ancient ways, because they knew how to make the food safe and us healthier and our microbiome healthier without all the microscopes and the testing. But they certainly didn't just assume all microbes were friendly.
Let's come back to our plantain flour and expand out to fiber as a whole. I think it's important we make a distinction here, because in our world, in conventional thinking, there is this assumption that fiber is good, eat the rainbow, the more the better, and we're going to feed the microbes, the good ones, with that, and in turn, they're going to produce short-chain fatty acids, and all is good. So talk about fiber from that perspective as well.
So that was just not helpful advice for the public, right? And I think most people who have been chronically ill have really felt that, because in general, the less fiber you eat, the better you feel. The reason for that is that fiber feeds indiscriminately to some degree. So if you have a lot of overgrowths in your microbiome, it's going to feed the overgrowths and you can get more sick. If you have a lot of beneficial microbes, it's going to feed those and you can get healthier. But the advice was given to people that don't have a healthy microbiome. They're being born today in the last 30 years. So in general, fiber has been more problematic, which is where a lot of the ancestral diets that were low fiber really came in to save the day and help people get into remission from impossible conditions, right? So that's where you've got like carnivore and these low fiber diets or zero fiber diets. And that can be really useful. And then there's these little types of really more like glyconutrients, long chain polysaccharides that are much more medical. And these feed the little microbes. So I never ask anyone to sit down and eat a salad, for instance. Right? We might just be adding a little sprinkle of one of these guys. So fiber can be your friend or your foe. And based on yourself, because you feel it. So if you eat a lot and you feel worse, or your illness doesn't go away, you're in the camp that needs to eat way less and have very soft food that lets the little villi regrow. And that should be followed, definitely.
Let's come back to glyconutrients. This is something I want to make sure we covered. A unique aspect. I know you're a big fan. Not a lot of people talking about them. Give us the 101 to begin.
Glyconutrients are amazing. Okay, so think of them like sugars that heal. Okay, so these are sugars that are not sweet. They regulate the immune system. They block certain infections, pathogens, not opportunistic, but real pathogens from the body. And the more and more we learn about them, the more important they are. They block lectins, which lectins are in a lot of our quote unquote health foods, but they are very helpful for blocking them from causing the damage in our body if the food isn't prepared appropriately ancestrally. So glyconutrients are pretty amazing, and there's something that you can incorporate into your diet or you can buy as a supplement. But I think as more and more autoimmunity surges, we're going to see a lot more use of glyconutrients in the future because it's so good at regulating that immune system, whether it's suppressed or high. So too high, so too aggressive. So to give you an example, everybody's seeing all these mushrooms on the market, right? Reishi and maitake and turkey tail. They're used for cancer and all these different things, lion's mane. Those are examples of glyconutrients. So there's 8 different medical ones, and it's possible that we'll find more. But I learned about them years ago, about 20 years ago now, and I just find them absolutely incredible at what they can do. And going back to the mucosa, actually, if you are someone who has tried a medical mushroom, like a reishi, and it has not gone well, and say you have chronic fatigue syndrome and you were hoping to improve your energy and instead you felt sick on it, that is an indication that your mucosa is in a full stage of collapse. So you can act as such and act accordingly.
All right, I want to make sure we're practical here again. We know there's 8 different ones. You've mentioned some of the foods where we can get them. What other foods provide those, and what would the spectrum need to be to get the variety we want, and how much do we need? I know there's a lot there, but I just want to be really practical somebody who's intrigued now wanting to get these on a regular basis, what does that look like?
Okay, so the glyconutrients, you really do need all 8. One you're going to have, your body makes glucose. So that one we're good on. So you really need the other 7. Tiny amounts are plenty. You don't need a lot, honestly. So to give you like a quarter of a teaspoon is plenty. You can certainly go higher if you like. If I was sick again, I would use a lot of these. I would use as many as I could afford. So one that many people know of is mannose, and mannose is used against like UTIs and things like that. But mannose is found in a lot of areas that people aren't aware of, right? We think of mannose, we think of cranberries, we think of aloe vera, but it's also in chicken cartilage and egg yolk and shrimp shells. So you can get it on a carnivore diet, and that one is really good. Not just for UTIs, but for allergies. It's neuroprotective, nerve repair, mitochondrial support. It goes a long, long way for benefits. But then you have galactose, and galactose, that's in dairy products. That's your cheese, your yogurt, your colostrum, right, for your little babe. And it's also found in some organ meats as well. So if you can't do dairy, it can be found there. Another xylose, I think we may have talked about that in the last one. But we definitely mentioned it earlier today. That's found in some of the tree barks, right? Like birch tree bark has it. You can actually tap birch trees to get xylitol, and that's a great one, especially for head and dental health, ear infections, things like that. Very preventative, very preventative. But it's also found in chicken skin and connective tissue, so you can get it in the animal world as well. Let's see. There's a few others. One found in shrimp shells, chicken cartilage. I think it's also found in shiitake as well. And what are some other foods I can give you? Oh, there's one that's in seaweed, right? We see a lot of seaweed promoted, but it's also in turkey cartilage and oysters if you can't do plants. So that's a really good one. And then there's fucose. That's not fructose or fructose. It's fucose. That's in the animal world, carnivore. You would get that in seaweed-fed animals. So like oysters is where you would find that. But it's also in wakame seaweed specifically, and maitake and reishi. So there's usually multiple ways to get them. Sialic acid is probably the one that I see the least, and I see a lot of people missing that. There's a lot of autoimmunity or health conditions that tends to be very low in sialic acid, like Parkinson's, MS, Alzheimer's, a lot of nervous system disorders. And that's found in brain, animal brain, which is a common food in all the places I go, but it's not eaten here. You can get little amounts in chicken liver or in egg yolks, a little bit in wakame, but really animal brain is kind of the main source of that. So, yeah.
It sounded like there was some overlap there, certain foods that contain different ones. Is there, say, 3 or 4 different foods somebody could put together on a regular basis to make sure they're getting the full spectrum?
Well, I have, you know what, this might motivate me. So I have a huge glyconutrient document that I put together just for my clients. So if your audience, let's say they subscribe or something, we need to give them a name or something, have a tag name, put in, what do you want to make it? Make fun. But put it in, I'll give you guys we can get you the document. So I'll try to get that up before this goes live, but that gives you recipes and little teas, and that saves you a ton of money from the supplements because the supplements are expensive. Hopefully I can get that up. It's a huge document. It's like 80 pages.
Do you mean a code that they'd put in?
Yeah.
How about we just make it Jesse? Keep it easy.
Done. Jesse.
Awesome.
Jesse.
What is the brand of supplement for somebody that wants an easy way to get the array?
So none of them have all of it, but I actually have that pulled up here. So let me grab it for you. The one I used is ambertose, and it's only missing a couple. Let's see here. Yeah, ambertose has all of it except for sialic acid. Which we just went over. So that would be the easiest. The other ones, the lectin guard is missing about 5 of them. Lectin protect is missing about 5. Lectin defense is missing 4. So that would be the easiest. You could also do a tea. It tastes awful, but it's a recipe I put together for folks that want to save a lot of money. It really does taste so bad. So don't expect your kids to eat this or drink this. But if you do fenugreek plus shiitake plus kelp plus whey protein plus bovine cartilage and psyllium husk, you do get all of them. Now, I realize a lot of listeners or watchers will not be able to do all those foods. So, it's case by case. But if you can, that's the cheapest way to go.
For people that haven't known of these or been mindful of their consumption of them, what do you notice when they start to include the array on a regular basis?
Two things. I tend to notice the autoimmunity, the ANA scores, and the other ones regulate. And I also notice that they don't get sick when others don't, when others do get sick. Something that a lot of people report as well is an improvement in energy. But that would, of course, depend on all their other biochemical stuff going on. But those are the three main.
Earlier, you talked about William Davis, his rotary yogurt. I'm a fan of that as well. But that gets me thinking about SIBO, which is something we should talk about given our focus on the microbiome. So talk about what that is and then how you go about assessing somebody for it and treating somebody.
So SIBO is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and there's multiple forms that you can have. It can be from methane-producing bacteria or sulfur-producing bacteria or hydrogen-producing bacteria. There's tests you can get for it, although, and this is just my opinion, in my experience in practice, if you have other health conditions, you usually want to get at those first before SIBO, because SIBO can be caused by so many different things. And so if you go straight for SIBO, you can be on this, gerbil wheel of treating and it coming back and treating, and it can be very defeating. Whereas if you get at the cause, then it's just a one and done, or sometimes you don't even have to go at it directly, because getting at the cause means it goes away. So some of the causes. The most common cause back in the day was simply traveling overseas and getting traveler's diarrhea. That one's an easy to treat, slam dunk. Anybody can help you with that. If it's 10 years later, and that's a different story. So usually with that, we're dealing either with histamine intolerance. So histamines are overproduced, or the mucosal layer has collapsed. So you've got all these histamines that are impacting the ileocecal valve, which is a little valve about 1.5 inches to the right of the belly button. And it's impacting whether it stays open or shut. So if it's open, you're having a lot of diarrhea. That is usually the hydrogen, though not always. And if it's kind of shut, then you're having more constipation, and that is the methane more often than not. So the trick to that is to get at the histamines, not to go directly at the SIBO, right? And so whether it's histamines from you don't produce enough DAO enzyme to break down the histamines, or you need more mucosa, or you're lacking the microbes that regulate histamines. Whatever you need to get at your histamines, you do that. And then the biggest crowd that I see are the nervous system disorders, because I work with very disabled people. So, they don't have their myelin sheaths, their what's called the migratory motor complex. It's the nervous system within the gut lining. It makes up about 70% of our nervous system. It's broken. So it's just not moving at the correct speed, right? The brain and none of it's communicating appropriately. And so we have to get at the whole nervous system, really, to get the speed of movement through the digestive system to move along. And so we go about it that way. But there's certain conditions that I like to think of. If we think of building, right? Let's say we're building a skyscraper. You have the foundation first. And that's going to be like your first step. And that's going to be different with each person based on what you're dealing with, all right? But if we're talking about the microbiome, that would be your initial seeding. And then the first level would be breast milk, right? And then the third would be oxytocin bonding with your family, right? And so you have all these layers. Well, with illness, it's the same. So if you have a number of diagnoses, you want to take an eagle eye view, and you want to look at, is it immune? Is it nervous system? What are we dealing with here? A lot of times, SIBO is nervous system. So you want to work on the nerves. SIBO is the last thing. It's the penthouse. You don't build the penthouse first. You do it last. So that's what I would recommend. A lot of the protocols I see to go after SIBO, I think are very defeating for the clients and the patients.
As you were talking there about foundation, it got me thinking about your diagnosis and your story, which we did talk about in detail. We won't go back into the details today. But in a general sense, because I know you've changed your ways, like we've talked about already today. Give us an overview of what you did then and what you do now with the new knowledge. I think it'd be interesting to compare and contrast how your thoughts have changed.
I like that so much. Okay, so then I had a full lifestyle routine for years going into it, right? So woke up at the same time, ate at the same time, meditated, gratitude journal, light therapy, you name it, I was doing it every day, like a military person. But the food that I ate was the same bowl of chicken soup for every single meal that was homemade. And it was just chicken, carrots, onions, ghee, and broth that was homemade. And it was not bone broth, it was meat broth. So it was a GAPS intro diet. I stayed on it for 2 years. Didn't spread out the diet through that 2 years. And it was very good at getting me into remission. What I noticed was that a lot of people, especially once I became a practitioner, a lot of people developed SIBO on that and all these other things. A lot of people gain a lot of weight after GAPS, a lot. And now we know a lot of the birth microbes needed to regulate weight need some other foods. So you can do it very strategically. So how I would do it now is I would be sprinkling in little foods for my birth microbes. And I would stick to lower histamine foods. And I would actually very strategically do it. So the GAPS diet was really a graduation of a diet called SCD, which is specific carbohydrate diet. Very similar to that, very minor changes, but it made a big difference. And this is traditional in the dietary world with all the microbial damage that we've had. Graduations are needed, upgrades are needed, and now we're needing an upgrade. So I'm working on that now. I'm doing it with the people that I work with, but I'm working on getting it to the public as to what you can do. But how I do it differently is totally different. I would do less soup, actually. I would do less broth because it's so histaminic. I would first get a GI map to make sure I don't have any mucosal eaters. I would be feeding those birth microbes like it was my primary job. I would also, because I'm a curious person, this isn't something the public needs to do, but since you asked for me, I would be testing every 3 months to make sure I was making progress on my microbiome. And I would graduate as soon as possible. So I wouldn't just keep doing it because it had worked. I would start bringing in more foods as soon as I could, but they would be specific. They wouldn't be for pleasure. It wouldn't be like potato chips. It would be like foods for the birth microbes. So that's how I would do it different.
And would the glyconutrients be part of that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, but I tend to use those anyway.
Okay. What about other
Yeah.
supplements?
Oh, I would be planting. So, I was one of the lucky ones who came from a very healthy family, but I would be monitoring and planting and feeding for those microbes. So if I saw, this is a microbe we didn't discuss, but F. prosnotzi or Roseburia, populations dwindling, I would immediately be feeding them their specific food. So I've totally flipped, right? Because the first 10 years, 15 years I was working, I used almost no testing. And now I find with the microbial collapse, I really want a GI map on everyone first so that you can address those things preventatively.
And for somebody that their health is deteriorated and you're working with them, how different is that prognosis if they have the birth microbes and they are born that way versus somebody who didn't?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. I don't find that it makes the illness any less awful. I don't find it makes the recovery any easier. I find that it makes the remission very solid.
And to make sure I fully understand this part, somebody that didn't go through the birth canal, they likely or even certainly will need to keep adding those microbes in. They'll never stick like somebody that got them at birth.
I don't want to say they'll never stick, but by the very nature of their birth, they have been given a weaker state. So they're more vulnerable. It doesn't mean that they will succumb to something. It means that they're more vulnerable. And so building that foundation of health that I got, mine was so solid, right? And a large part of that is because I still had those microbes and we didn't know how important they were, but we do now. So someone born C-section or second generation C-section, they don't have those. And so unless we can plant them, which we can't plant all of them right now, uh, until we can get them in, it just makes them more vulnerable. It doesn't mean that they will succumb to something or that their condition will come back. It just means that they're not as solid because they weren't given their birthright, right?
At this stage you're at now in your health journey, you're healed, you're doing great. Any current experiments that you're doing with your diet, with supplements, or different protocols, and you're excited about what you're seeing?
Yeah. So I've been experimenting more this year than ever before. And a lot of it is going into stuff that you guys aren't going to see just yet. But I've been experimenting with how fast we can get these guys to plant and which ones are the best ones. And so I've been having a lot of my, microscopic fun and also pulling together a lot of the research. So I've written over 200 articles. I'm working on 3 books, one of which is like, these are the birth microbes that starve out at these rates so that you can go without testing, right? And modify these diets with our current knowledge. So tons of research. And then I've had 3 studies come out on the dysautonomia program. And actually so much. I've worked on more this year than ever before, and it's really exciting.
How do you feel about a couple of the hot supplements in our world right now? Creatine, methylene blue, a couple that jump out at me right away.
So methylene blue, a lot of people get benefit from, but it really depends on where your mitochondria is at. So a lot of the most popular things to take, whether it's like NAD or um, even MOTS-C, the peptide, which is good for mitochondrial health, or methylene blue, if your mitochondria are fully shut down, it can actually crash you further. So you would either need to work with someone who's very schooled or do a lot of research or just not do it. Wait till your mitochondria are healthier. But for someone who's pretty moderately healthy, they can be amazing. That's why so many people like them.
And creatine?
Yeah, I mean, that can be really good for energy. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, you can test if you need it. There's a intracellular test that you can do, like Cell Science, or you can just try it. But it does give people quite a bit of recovery in energy. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of talk now using it for brain health versus in the past more muscle building.
Yes, because the brain needs a lot of energy.
Well, that could bring in ketones.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I know you're a fan of ketosis in general.
Yes.
Talk about why that can be such an energy giving diet.
Oh, it's amazing because it bypasses a lot of the damage. So we've really damaged a lot of our energy systems. Many people are not using their standard ATP energy cycle. The Krebs cycle is a hot mess. They're using the backup lactic acid. These are, if someone experiences chronic fatigue for any reason, this is usually what's going on. And ketosis bypasses that. It uses fat for energy. And so once you get past the transition phase, which usually is too long for people's comfort, right? They think they're dying at like day 3. But if you can get past the first few weeks, then you can get real energy that is much more stable and is incredibly good for the brain and the nervous system, right? If I had a relative, or if I had a relative who had Alzheimer's or dementia, immediately ketosis. Cancer, immediately ketosis. And that's just like a foundational that you want to go to. So again, that would just be my own personal. That's not recommendations for you all. But it's such a good form of steady energy, and it also really helps the mood and the immune system. Right? It's a naturally antiviral state when you're in the blood levels of ketosis. Doesn't mean you can't get a virus, but it's much less likely. Your mood is stable because your blood sugar is stable. So your cholesterol isn't being spun out to go balance your blood sugar. It can make your sex hormones. It can make your feel-good hormones, and it's a wonderful food for the brain. So it prevents the diabetes, the type 3 diabetes of the brain. It's just a really good overall, uh, great thing to do with the current state of modern health because most of the conditions that we have are due to mitochondrial and glucose systems being damaged. So you can bypass that with ketosis, which is great.
Earlier, we got into fiber and the fiber myth. I'm glad we covered that. I want to pivot off that and talk about fermented foods. Again, something we should really cover in a conversation about the microbiome. So early on in somebody's healing journey versus later on, you've talked about histamine, bring that in as well. And then what can we get to actually repopulate from those foods?
So what I've found, and this could be correlation, so take this with a grain of salt, but what I've found with a lot of traditional ferments from around the globe is that the ferment has the microbe, that the beneficial microbe in the region that it comes from, that is the best against the pathogens in that region. So if we look to Latin and South America, and we think of the Spanish conquest and what happened to the Mayans, right? The story we've all heard is that smallpox, right? Smallpox took down the populations. Well, it was really a year later when this happened. And the traditional ferments of that region produced the right microbes to actually prevent things like smallpox. So really, when you take out the traditional ferments of the region, you don't have as many protections against the pathogens of the region. So, someone coming from Russia is really going to push beet kvass. And someone coming from, let's say Mexico City is going to push pulque, my favorite. It's my favorite. It's delicious to me. And so each region is going to have their own thing. They can be good. Something like a kefir has a lot of antihistamine strains. So does kimchi, actually. So most ferments are pretty high histamine, but it depends how long they're fermented. The cheeses in France, they're raw, and they do raw right in France. So health food. And it's not like England. Sorry, England. And and so it's protecting you from things in that region. Same with Mongolia. So the traditional ferments can be good to use, but what I see done more in America and Australia and kind of places where this has become a fad to like bring in lots of them, is that they're used like a side dish, whereas really they're meant to be condiments, right? Traditional mustard is a ferment. You can make it in 5 minutes. It's fabulous. And each one is going to have different little microbes that help you. The only thing I would say is that a lot of them are lacta ferments, and those are going to increase lactic acid, which can overstimulate the nervous system. So if you're someone who has a lot of anxiety, just see how you feel on them. You may not feel as great on those. It may be too much lactic acid for you. May not be. There's different causes of anxiety, but I think they're pushed as this cure-all, and they are important, but they're not nearly as important as our birth microbes. They don't make up for them.
The way you navigated that, talking about different areas and having their specific fermented foods, it gets me thinking about us here in the West and people that are praising these and thinking they're great and bringing all of them together and putting them in their fridge. How do you look at that from a geographic analysis of the health benefits?
It's definitely not ancestral. It's not ancestral. Yeah. And of course, it depends if you're making your own versus if you're importing, because some of these microbes are regional. So like anyone who's tried to make sourdough bread, there's a reason why San Francisco Bay Area loves their sourdough, right? There's certain regions where certain microbes do best in. So if you're importing it from those regions, like when I have someone with sinus issues without a swab, we're going to go for El Sakai, which is found in Korean kimchi. That's not going to be found necessarily in the kimchi made here, even if it's made from scratch. So sometimes we seek that out to get the right microbe. But so it would depend if you had made them all yourself or if you were cultivating them or bringing them from elsewhere. But in general, it's not very traditional. And yeah. It's not very traditional.
Earlier, we talked about when we were talking about babies, the adults, their oral microbiome, supplementing and passing that on to the kids. Let's zoom back and talk about the oral microbiome as a whole. What are the things we're doing that's having a negative impact? And then other things we can do to build that back up.
so much. Most of the things that we're doing are damaging the oral microbiome. And I think you even see it when I came back to America. It seemed like every advertisement was not for pharmaceuticals. I mean, it still is, but for anything for breath. So like humans are just stinky right now, and we shouldn't be stinky. So the oral microbiome mouthwash ruins it. It also ruins your ability to make nitric oxide, which is rather important for most health conditions and just life in general. Most of the toothpaste that's used is pretty damaging. Floss is typically made from plastic. The floss I buy is from silk. It's a traditional silk floss, so you can get natural ones. And I promise, as hoity-toity as it sounds, it's not expensive. And in traditional societies, it would be more like they would suck on cloves instead of all this gum and mints and things like that. So if one is going to use something like a gum or a mint, I would use a xylitol-based one for sure. And ideally from birch trees, not from corn. That would be the most ideal. And then I would look at why we're using it. Are we using it because we have a dry mouth? If we have a dry mouth, that indicates that our sympathetic nervous system is dominant. So that's a time to do way more exhales than inhales, right? So we can start practicing in the car, inhaling for 2, exhaling for 10, right? Different practices to activate the parasympathetic nervous system so we get saliva, because this is how we digest. You can also just breathe through the left nostril. I like dancing. You can dance as well. And then if it's more for the smell, you want to look at the microbiome from here on up. And you can certainly just go and get some of the oral probiotics from Amazon or wherever you want to buy them from. There's quite a few brands that sell them. Salivarius, K12, and 18, those are really important ones. The nasal, it's more L-Sakai, but there's a whole host of them there. So those can be very good. Oil pulling is great. And if you have more gum type issues, you can use things like ozone oil. Like if you have an infection or you have ozone oil is very good for that. So we have lots of options for that. But I'd say in the past, antimicrobial was the way people went, and we're paying the price for that now. So I would go less antimicrobial and more probiotic and nourishing.
Let's pivot over to the skin now. Same question. What are we doing there to destroy the microbiome? And then what are some of the practices you use on a regular basis to maintain and build that?
So most of the things that we're doing against the skin microbiome is overwashing, using antimicrobial soaps or perfumed soaps, using polyesters, most of the gym clothes, like the really expensive fancy gym clothes is kind of the worst. And not getting enough sun. So those would be the main things. And then further, putting anything on the skin that's not edible. So on my skin, I just use edible oils. So it might be tallow or almond oil or what have you. It depends where I am. And you can use, my favorite thing for the skin is a shower filter. It's called the Sprite shower filter. It's about $30. I've used it for about 20 years. It's amazing. It's really good. It takes away most issues, which is pretty good. You can also get salt bars. So let's say you have a skin condition like tinea versicolor. There's a number of ways to go about that, but you get those Himalayan salt bars for like exfoliation and a little bit of antimicrobial that's not going to damage the good microbes, right? Bar soap, you can use a whole fat, so you can use the olive oil or the tallow. And then there are some companies that are making some probiotic skin things, and you can certainly make your own as well. So that can be done too.
Lights came up a couple times. Let's talk about in a practical sense what that looks like for the microbiome on the skin and in general.
It's so imperative. It sounds too simple and too free and all of that, but getting out before sunrise, about half an hour before sunrise, makes a massive difference on your health, and then staying for a following hour. It is imperative for our circadian rhythm, which again is Over a quarter of our population is taking anti-anxiety, antidepressant. If you throw in sleep medications on top of that, the percentage goes through the roof. And in order to get the sleep hormones and the feel-good hormones, you need to get light in your eyes and on your skin, right? In the morning, we should be producing our cortisol to pop us out of bed, and our serotonin and our dopamine. And this is when we want cortisol, right? And those should trigger melatonin at night. But all of that requires being outside, no matter the weather. So that part is rather important. It also does shift the microbiome. So the microbiome of the skin shifts. Like when I go to tribes, if I get to a region that has been colonized and so they're wearing donated t-shirts, they get skin fungus and things from the polyester. Whereas when I go into deeper regions where there aren't any t-shirts, there's none of that. So the fabric and the light are both very important.
How do you feel about this trend in our world, vitamin D supplementation, as being part of a baseline package that most quote unquote experts would agree is essential? Tie that into the light and how you look at the difference there.
We really want to make our vitamin D. We really want to make it. Now, you do need some microbes to make it. So I think this is why we have some of the problems we have. But it's a hormone. And while we can take hormones, it is best if we make them on our own. Our tinkering has gotten us into a lot of trouble. So that means eating quite a bit of cholesterol and then getting into the sun and then having the right microbes as well. But the first two you can definitely do. Taking vitamin D on its own short term could be safe, but long term is problematic because it depletes the animal form of vitamin A. And with this huge trend around the world to eat less animal products and eat more vegetable, plant food, we already have vitamin A deficiencies widespread, and the animal form again. And this isn't a common form in supplements, and it needs to be at the correct ratio with K2. You find this in like the spring and the fall butter. You find this in whole foods. But if you take high levels of vitamin D, it drives down your vitamin A. And that sets the stage for cancer.
Important stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, last question for today. I want to bring in sound. And we alluded to the story about the drumming and the fungi earlier. People can go back and listen to our previous chats and find that. But again, in a practical sense, in the modern world, given the impact there, what does that look like in a healthy sense? And what's that relationship like?
So we talked a little bit about circadian rhythm. And anyone who's listening who grew up on a farm will know what animal wakes up first, and then the order of which the animals wake up. And there's an order. Chickens and the birds are first. Their song actually wakes up the circadian rhythm of the other animals. And in fact, the plants in the area reply to their song as well. Ours does as well. So the more that we can listen to the sounds of nature truly, right? Like in Japan, they call it a vitamin, right? They have them walk in the forest. Weekly, it's just normal. But really daily, we need to be hearing birdsong. We need to have the light coming through the trees. So the light coming through the trees softly triggers gamma waves in our brain, which is the wave that gives us awe and bliss and gratitude. The sounds really regulate our entire circadian rhythm, morning, noon, and night. And so that's very, very important. Whereas the sounds in our household, the low-grade buzzing and all of that, more and more is coming out on that not being so great for our little microbiome. So I certainly live in the modern world. I am using a computer and all the things. But you want to go outside as often as possible. I'm lucky enough to have a mythical dog, so he gives me all the excuses in the world. But if you don't have that, I would find excuses to be outside as often as possible and to listen, to take your earbuds out, to actually listen and have your eyes looking up so you stimulate dopamine rather than down at the phone, right? This is closing off the lymph. This opens the lymph. And pretend like the modern world doesn't exist for a few hours a day. That would help a lot.
All right, Mary, we're going to end it there for today. A lot of great new information. It's an exciting time for you. I can tell you're in the midst of doing a lot of research, experimenting, Can't wait to see what all comes of it. We'll have to have another conversation. We're going to link up your website, your social media, everything in the show notes. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Now that you're done, you're going to want to stick around here and catch this other incredible episode. You don't want to miss it. I'll see you over there.
We've been told to push fiber and that it's good for bacterial diversity, but diversity doesn't equal health. What equals health is what bacteria are in the gut. We like to think the microbiome is the gut. It's not. It's everything. Getting a lot